Welcome to this 10-part series about the Danish author Martinus, hosted by me, Lauge Schøler, and my co-host Karsten Jensen. The aim of this series is to provide an in-depth overview of Martinus and his work, The Third Testament. Martinus is mostly known in Scandinavia. However, there is a growing interest around the world in non-dogmatic approaches to spirituality, and as such, many non-Scandinavian speakers whom we assume will find his teachings interesting. But since most material about Martinus is in Danish, it can be a challenge for people outside of Scandinavia to know where to start or get a proper overview of the material. Over these 10 episodes, we dive into some technical detail as we try to convey some of Martinus's ideas. Martinus's work is vast and complex and takes up over 10,000 written pages, but we have picked 10 of the most central ideas to explore. We strive to make it as accessible as possible, and we hope it can provide the initial understanding of the most basic concepts that will make further study of his text more digestible. If you're interested in Martinus and his cosmology, you're welcome to visit martinus.dk for more information. In Denmark, there's an institute in Copenhagen which maintains the day-to-day administration, and there is a summer holiday center in Klint in northern Sjælland, where people interested in Martinus meet and study his works. Please enjoy. Yeah, welcome to episode 1.
Yes, I'm Karsten.
And I'm Lauge.
And we are situated at the Martinus Institute in Copenhagen because we want to introduce all the listeners out there to the Danish writer and lecturer Martinus.
Exactly, and perhaps we should just start with just a tiny bit of our personal background, personal stories.
Good idea.
It's not so much about us, it's absolutely about Martinus, but just to give the most brief overview about our background.
Yeah, so maybe I should go first because
Sure,
I think I started reading Martinus before you did. So my background for reading Martinus is that when I was 25 years old in 1988, at that time I was a die-hard atheist, metaphysical materialist. Sure. There is only physical matter and life is meaningless. And one night I had a kind of spiritual experience that kind of broke down the whole kind of worldview I had and opened me up. So I went to bed being the kind of guy who felt I've seen it all. What else can you show me? Mm-hmm. And had some very strange experiences during sleep in a kind of lucid dream. And I woke up and suddenly I knew nothing and just had a lot of questions about who I was and are we immortal and things like that. Mm-hmm. And that brought me into a kind of life crisis. And I think I went for 3 years that were quite difficult until things started to change. And it was just when things started to change, one day I found Martinus's book, his capital work, Livets Bog, mm-hmm. in Danish, which means the book of life. Mm-hmm. And I found it on my local library and started reading and was just mind blown and thrilled about what I was reading because I found it hugely interesting, fascinating. And so I've studied it ever since and lectured about it and written about it.
Yeah. Sure. Interesting. Yeah. And my story is that I grew up in southern Denmark and in a very normal household and with no particular big questions raised about philosophy or spirituality or anything. And I remember also going to church just once in a while and having this sense that there's something important here. But it's for me, it was always wrapped in this very dry setup that it didn't really appeal to me. This very dogmatic Christianity that you'll find in most churches. And I had I had a hunch that there was something hidden beneath that structure, but I couldn't identify with whatever the priest says, and especially about they were not talking about life on other planets, or talk about reincarnation or anything. It was just pretty much just reading it aloud from the Bible. So I had this hunch that there was something going on, and then I had a very atheistic period in my late teens and early 20s. And then I started to listen to Martinus lectures and some other people talking about Martinus in their lectures. And then suddenly it dawned on me, like finally there was an explanation for particularly these logical explanations that I've been hungry for. Like, why does bad thing happen to good people? Mm-hmm. That's one of the key, for me. I mean, people have many angles into Martinus, but at least for me, it was like he could answer those questions, these classic questions that also small kids would have. Why do bad things happen to good people? Or what's the meaning of the rest of the galaxy? Like, are we only here on Earth? What's the point of the rest of the universe? Stuff like that. He could answer those questions that most kids and teenagers would have. And then finally, like when I first heard these lectures, when I was in my early 20s, I was mind blown. Finally, somebody is answering these questions that I...
Yeah, so you had a set of values that suddenly received some kind of explanation or foundation in a logical analysis.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that some of the experience that you had with Christianity, Martinus actually had himself.
Sure.
Yeah. So Martinus, he's this Danish writer he was born in 1890 and he died in 1981. And he was the first 30 years of his life was quite unremarkable.
Yeah.
So he was brought up in the countryside, just about as far away from Copenhagen as you can come.
Exactly. He was born out of wedlock, and he was adopted by his uncle and his uncle's wife, and they were both illiterate peasants. So he had a very, very modest, but also very kind upbringing. They were very good people.
For sure.
Yeah.
So he was always very grateful for the kind of upbringing he had.
Exactly.
And he didn't go much to school. That's another thing. He only went to school for 7 years and only some months every year, as was normal in the countryside back then. Yeah. You had to help out on the farm.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, very, very limited schooling, some basic writing, basic math, and a bit of Bible history, which he found very interesting. He had like an intuitive sense that there was something right here.
I think he had a lot of Bible story. I think that was one of the main components in his schooling, as he told it himself. So he knew his Bible very, very well. But apart from that, he wasn't a literate, not at least in any academical sense. But I was thinking about this fact that he had these very strong religious feelings, and he loved reading in the Bible and some of the stories there.
Yeah.
And also he prayed a lot, even from childhood. And he had the Christ as a kind of ideal that he tried to live by. He would ask himself, if he was in a situation, what would the Christ have done in this situation? And he would sense... this he could have done, or this he couldn't have done. And then he would or would not do it himself. Yeah. But where he kind of matches up with your story is that he heard these priests talking about things like, if you're not baptized, you go to hell.
Exactly.
So the Christianity where he was brought up was quite harsh. And also, you told he was born out of wedlock. And there was this priest who told him that there was a certain kind of curse to children who was born out of wedlock.
Exactly, yeah. And he wanted to, when he was little, he thought, when I grow up, I wanted to be a teacher, but they had no money for that. And then he thought he would be a missionary, but then he couldn't promote or preach that particular kind of Christianity, which was the only version that he knew about. Yeah. In the early version, because he had these intuitions even as a young child that there was something more to it. There was some good ideas, some good directions in that Christianity that was presented at the time, but he was not. He just couldn't agree with all of it.
Yeah, and maybe you should tell that the first 30 years of his life was actually quite unremarkable.
Exactly.
So he had all these minor jobs.
I think we can just go through the chronology here, just to get a slight overview for the listeners.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
I think he started out as wanting to be an apprentice with a blacksmith. Or
exactly. Yeah. And but he was too physically weak to do it. Yeah. And then when from he was 17 years old, he started to become a dairyman. And that became kind of his main profession for most of his young life.
Yes. And apart from that, he had a few other jobs. He worked as a postman, as a night watch. Yeah. He was also in the Danish Marine during World War I, but never saw any action because Denmark was not a part of World War I.
Yeah, so he was like a personal assistant to a captain on a boat and so on. And that was in... he moved to Copenhagen in 1913, to serve in the Navy. Yeah.
And this is also when we come close to 1921, you talked about him thinking about becoming a missionary. Yeah. And that was actually because he had a kind of life crisis. Yeah. He at that time he was working as a clerk in a dairy. Exactly. So he was sitting there writing numbers all day. Yeah. And it felt kind of meaningless to him. He couldn't understand. Yeah. Is that the meaning of life? That you have to write these thousands of numbers each day. Yeah. So he had this kind of crisis where he contemplated becoming a missionary, but felt that couldn't happen because he was not kind of he couldn't do with the dogmatism of Christianity. Yeah. So it seemed like an impossible path for him to move down.
Exactly, and it was like, but I think most people who knew him back then, like from his upbringing in northern Denmark and his time in the Navy, and he was working as a clerk and as an administrative assistant in a big dairy office in Copenhagen and so on. And most people who knew him from back then, they said that he had a very positive influence on most people around him.
Yeah.
Even though this was before his spiritual experiences, that we'll get to in a minute. But he was considered like very bright, very kind, very moral. He couldn't lie. Like if he was about to be squeezed into a situation where he was asked by somebody to lie to get out of it, he just wouldn't do it. So he had this very strong moral compass all the way from the beginning.
Yeah. So there was a situation where his boss at the dairy wanted him to he answered the phone. Mm-hmm. And the boss told him to say that the boss wasn't there, and Martinus simply refused. He said, "Well, I can't do that because that's not the truth." Yeah. So he was that kind of guy that found it impossible to lie or steal. And I think it's the question he would ask himself: would the Christ have done this? Exactly. And he would feel no, he couldn't have done it. Well, then he wouldn't do it either.
Yeah, exactly. And I also like to say that we will get into the whole thing about Martinus' relationship to Christianity in a separate episode, because that's a whole different
for sure
thing to unpack. This is like it's a different theme in of itself. But it's to say that he had when he was young, he had a huge inspiration in the ideal of Christ, in the ideal of how to behave as a human being.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and he also
and had prayer as well. And prayer, so that was kind of his spiritual praxis. Yeah. Prayer. Whenever he had some kind of troubles, I mean, even as a child, when he walked to school, he would pray that he would remember what they had to read at home and so on.
Exactly. And he always had this sense of wonder. There's one anecdote when he was maybe 10 years old or so, that he was to sit under the stars and look up and think, what's the meaning of all this? Yeah. Because like there's something going on, but what is the point of this whole menagerie, this whole thing going on before your eyes? There must be some point to it, but he thought he couldn't understand it at that point.
No. Yeah. And then in 1921 something happened.
Exactly, because he had this, as you mentioned, this idea that I'm meant for something more than just writing numbers and going to the cinema once in a while. I mean, there must be something more to it. And then he had this colleague at the dairy office called Ove Hubert, who had read a book about spiritual traditions, about theosophy, and it was about past lives and so on. And he talked to Martinus about this. And then Martinus asked, does it have anything to do with prayer? And then that... Actually,
that was a little later. Sure. So Martinus thought that the idea of reincarnation,
Sure.
he had never thought about it because he didn't know about these things, but it made sense to him immediately.
Yeah.
But this colleague of his, he had borrowed the book from another guy called Lars Nibelvang.
Yeah, Lars Nibelvang, yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually him Martinus went to.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And asked him, does this new movement, does it have anything to do with prayer? Because he wanted to be sure that it was in line with what you could call his spiritual practice.
Exactly, yeah. Because he said, like, if it doesn't have anything to do with prayer, I think I'll be done with that.
Yeah,
pretty soon.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
It's just that maybe we should mention that this colleague of Martinus, he had borrowed this book from Lars Nibelvang, and Martinus immediately wanted to learn more about what is this about. But of course, this guy, he couldn't lend the book to Martinus because it wasn't his own. So he kind of facilitated the meeting between Lars Nibelvang, who became very important for Martinus, and Martinus himself.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a very interesting meeting. He met this Lars Nibelvang person, and he had read all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and he was a musician, I think, classical musician.
Yeah.
Working professionally in an orchestra.
Exactly. Yeah, and he read all sorts of like Eastern mysticism, Western mysticism, all kind of things. And after that initial meeting, then in Martinus he got to borrow the book from him, and then Lars Nibelvang says, "Well, I think soon you will be my teacher." Yeah,
and there's a funny thing that Lars Nibelvang himself tells that Martinus never told, but Lars Nibelvang, he wrote a diary, and in this diary he also he said that he quoted some Indian mystic, Ramakrishna, I think, saying that if you put your mind to God always, everything will be well.
Sure.
But Martinus never told that, and maybe it's just, I mean, Lars Nibelvang making this thing up. But Martinus borrowed the book, and he brought it back to his apartment and started reading.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing, and it was about prayer. It was about meditation, right?
Yeah, it's a theosophical book. That's all. Actually, afterwards, you couldn't remember which book it was.
Yeah.
But it was a theosophical book. You could remember that. And in the beginning of the book, there was this instruction to do meditation, that you could sit down in a chair, you could blindfold yourself to filter out the sensory impressions, and you could meditate upon the concept of God.
Yeah.
And so he sat down in a chair, blindfolded himself.
Yeah, in his apartment in Copenhagen.
In his apartment, and meditated upon the concept of God.
Yeah.
And this is where he suddenly saw, for his inner vision, he saw this Christ figure.
This is what we call his first initiation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could come back to that, but later on he had two experiences over 2 days.
Yeah.
And the first experience he would later call the white baptism of fire. But when he was sitting there, he just suddenly saw this Christ figure. And it was in the Cathedral of Copenhagen. I think it's called Our Lady's Church or something like that.
Yeah.
There's a very famous statue by a Danish artist called Thorvaldsen. It's a marble statue, and it's the Christ with arms open, saying, "Come to me." That's a quote from the Bible. "Come to me, all ye who are tired and weary, and I shall give you peace." Something like that. And this is the kind of statue he saw for his inner vision.
Yeah.
But then the image kind of shifted. So at some point it disappeared. Then it came back, and then it became animated, and it had a kind of gown that was made of sparkling stars or things like that.
Yeah.
And eventually this Christ figure, it became huge, and it kind of went into Martinus's body and kind of penetrated his whole being.
Yeah.
And when he was penetrated by this Christ figure, he had all kinds of visions where he saw this light. He saw the planet, the globe, rotating around itself, and he felt this kind of light coming from himself, the Christ light coming through him, and kind of encompassing the whole planet.
Yeah, that's the thing. He saw the planet, and he saw it like rotating, and he saw ships and cities and landscapes and everything, and he.
Yeah, so it's quite detailed, this vision he had.
Exactly. And then it dawned on him, saying like, well, Christianity started 2,000 years ago, but it should be continued in some sense. And then he should be a part of that he should.
Yeah, I think that was later on in retrospect.
Yeah.
He came to interpret this experience as him having the mission to continue Christendom in an intellectualized form.
Sure. Yeah.
So that was the first day, the white baptism of fire.
Yeah.
And then the next day he sat down again.
Yeah.
Blindfolded himself.
Yeah.
And he was in for his inner vision. He was looking at this heaven, and under the heaven there was a shadow, and this shadow kind of rolled back, and there was a brighter heaven behind.
Yeah.
But still with a shadow that then rolled back. And that happened numerous times.
Yeah.
And eventually he came into this kind of highly energetic state where he felt immense pressure on his consciousness or his mind.
Yeah, in a pure golden aura, right?
Yes, everything was golden light.
Yeah.
And he felt one with God and with all living beings.
Yeah.
So later on he would for example, in his last lecture he did when he was 90, he talked about this experience of this golden light and became moved to the extent that he almost cried.
Yeah.
And he would talk about it as this kind of holy core that exists in all living beings.
Exactly.
So all living beings are the essence of all living beings, you could say, are this golden light through which we are united with the Godhead.
Exactly.
And with each other and with all other living creatures in the universe.
Exactly. He mentioned that he went like beyond the physical dimension and into this space where all beings, they fuse together into one consciousness.
Yeah.
Beyond the physical dimension.
Yes.
I guess that must be a very trippy experience when you just...
For sure, yeah. And it actually gave him a lot of headache afterwards.
Yeah.
So he tells he related how for days after this experience, after coming out of it, he had very strong headaches.
Yeah.
And I think it was the 24th of March 1921.
21, yeah.
He came out of these headaches. They kind of lifted.
Yeah.
And then he could start to kind of explore what had happened to him.
Yeah, it's a funny anecdote. I think after his first or second initiation, he came down to his landlady that he was renting his room from, and he said, "Oh, I just tried to meditate, and I had this magnificent vision." And the landlady, she didn't understand anything. She's like, "Oh, be careful with that. You can go insane from."
Yeah. But on the other hand, when he went back to Lars Nibelwang and told him about the experience, Lars Nibelwang, he didn't know about. He didn't have personal experiences, but he was very literate. He knew about mysticism and so on. So he knew about people describing union with the Godhead and so on from before. Yeah. So he became very interested.
Yeah.
And after having had this experience, another thing that happened was that Martinus found out he simply couldn't read. The first thing he wanted to do was to open a book, this theosophical book, and try to understand what had happened to him.
Yeah.
But he just felt this kind of pressure holding him back. It was impossible for him to open a book.
Yeah.
And he actually didn't read in a book for a number of years. But he started having conversations with Lars Nibelwang on a daily basis.
Sure.
And somewhere recently I read that for 3 years, they had these daily conversations.
Exactly. And I think we'll just get back to that in a second.
Yeah.
But I think we can just rest a bit on this concept of cosmic glimpses and cosmic consciousness.
Yeah.
You see, because what he experienced there, what he got a cosmic consciousness. He had this initiation, and he got a cosmic consciousness, which he was, as I understand, the first person who on the planet who got that permanent ability to see the cosmic laws of the universe.
I don't think he never said he was the first person on the planet, but there was not many, but the Christ, for example. Jesus was another example.
And he said like Buddha and Muhammad and those figures, they had part of it.
Yeah, but he never went into the specifics. But of course, it's quite obvious in Martinus's when he looked back at these different religions, there's a special place for the Christ. And he felt that his own mission was a continuation of that.
Exactly.
But also that it relates to Buddhism and Islam and other religions. It's also to an extent an intellectualization of the insights that are inherent in these religions. But it's what you talked about is this cosmic consciousness. So Martinus felt that he was initiated into. He also called it Christ consciousness.
Exactly.
Or Christ mentality. And at age 30, he felt that these two initiations, the white baptism of fire and the golden baptism of fire, was an initiation into Christ consciousness, or cosmic consciousness, as he would call it. And he felt that this was an extremely rare occasion on this planet, and there might not be anybody else at this time with cosmic consciousness who are in a physical incarnation. And but he also said that it's what we're all evolving towards.
Exactly. So
there's nothing special about it in that sense. Everybody, every living creature in the universe either have had cosmic consciousness
or will get it.
Or will get it, And actually we have had it all before we can come back to that. But
there's a whole other wrinkle on the whole thing.
So if we look at the kind of perspective on planetary evolution as had from mineral kingdom through plant kingdom and animal kingdom and so on, we come from a state that he calls cosmic consciousness. We're cosmically unconscious. That's it. And we're moving towards this state of cosmic consciousness. And in between those, you mentioned those cosmic glimpses.
Exactly. But you said that we're all on this trajectory towards the light, and we're all on this trajectory in development, and everyone, all living beings are going through. And in the beginning, you come from the unconscious state, and then you start at some point to have these cosmic glimpses. Where you just maybe once or twice in a whole lifetime, you will get this experience. It could either be like an experience of immortality or divine love, or you can be struck by the light or whatever kind of experience that you have. You get this tiny little sliver that opens up, and like you get this, and that's been described in various ways through literature that people have had these.
For sure. I mean, if you take Christian mysticism, but all the mystical traditions within different religions, you have these descriptions of what Martinus for certain would call a cosmic glimpse. So it's and also what you acquire in this state of cosmic consciousness is not say knowledge about how everything is in an instant, but it's more like you acquire this ability to explore and intuitively sense how things are. So he would also use the term intuition to describe what happened to him. What happened to him was that the faculty of intuition was awakened in him and came under his conscious control.
And perhaps you should here distinguish between what people normally call intuition and then what he says is like cosmic intuition.
So normally Martinus he has a kind of faculty psychology, you could call it, where we have different faculties. So we have instinct, we have something he called gravity, which is not what physicists call gravity, but it's kind of the drive we have towards manifestation and expansion into a physical space. And then we have feeling, and we have intelligence. And then latently we have, says Martinus, something called intuition, and it's latent in most of us.
Sure.
But we are in the process of awakening this faculty of intuition, and it's you could say it's intellectual. Mm-hmm. So normally when we talk about intuition, we talk more about
gut feeling,
like gut feeling or instinct, you could say.
Yeah.
In Martinus's terminology.
Yeah.
So things like gut feelings.
Yeah, like that's I think what usually people call intuition. Like if they have if they meet a person and have an intuition about how he or she is. But Martinus's term, he had this divine intuition, where like cosmic consciousness. And I think perhaps the best way I thought of it is like you have some sort of like a 24/7 X-ray vision of how the world works. Because if you just go around in the world as a normal person and you just see like, buildings and cars and people and so on, you just see like the surface structure of how everything is.
Yeah.
And you might be able to deduce a little bit of how life works and how society works and so on. But if you have cosmic consciousness, then you have this X-ray vision, that's my term, where you can see laws and principles and auras and energies and like planets and galaxies and so on. And you can get this, you can understand the principles. Like you see like karma and reincarnation and spirits and so on. And it's not clairvoyance in the technical sense. It's not like, and he wasn't like a medium in that sense either. He was just able to immediately understand, immediately intuit how the universe works, because he saw everything was governed by these laws, the spiritual laws that he had immediate access to.
Yeah, I guess we could come back to intuition on a later occasion and how it has a special meaning in Martinus's worldview.
Yeah,
but the thing about it is that as we talked about, he went back to Lars Nibelvang, told about his experiences. And Lars Nibelvang, he became very curious and started inquiring Martinus.
Sure.
And Lars Nibelvang was also a very skeptical man. He was extremely skeptical.
Yeah.
And so in the beginning, when they talked about some problems, he would also kind of push back on Martinus. And that taught Martinus to... what we have to understand that this intuitive faculty, it became kind of the basis for what we could call Martinus's mission in life, which was to write this, first his capital work, Livets Bog, the Book of Life.
Sure.
And later on he did some other things. But intuition was not enough because one of the things he shared about this intuitive capacity is that his intuitive insights came in a non-temporal and spatial form. They were formless in a sense.
Sure.
So he had to put it into form, into sentences, and also at some point he started doing symbols.
Yeah.
And for that he had to use his intelligence and his imagination.
Exactly, because his pedagogical mission, so to speak, was to make it accessible and digestible for normal people who didn't have cosmic consciousness, but who had some hunch and some sense that there might be something more going on than either just an atheistic worldview or a very dogmatic Christian worldview. Because that's what I get also with people who are interested in Martinus. They come from all sorts of angles and directions, because most people are hungry for a kind and intellectual explanation as to how the cosmos works.
Yeah.
And that's what he could give through his cosmic consciousness. And then he was talking to the Lars Nibelvang, who was very critical for a long while about, and he asked all sorts of questions like, how does it work technically with reincarnation and karma and blah, blah, blah. And then through a lot of question and answer, he kind of he built his repertoire, Martinus, about how he wanted to explain it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And so he went on. So he had a very difficult period. It actually took 7 years. So one thing was that he had to learn how to express himself, both speaking and writing, and in his symbols. Yeah. But he also had he acquired an extreme measure of sensibility in the first period, and it took a lot of willpower from him to overcome this sensibility, so it wasn't what do you say?
Inhibiting him?
Yes, so or disabling him.
Disabling him, yeah.
So, for example, he would sense, he shared that he would sense if people were sick,
exactly.
He would sense there are symptoms in his own body.
Yeah.
And there was this one story where he was actually thrown off
a tram or something.
A tram, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because there was some person there with diabetes.
Yeah.
And Martinus suddenly he started acting as if you were drunk or something like that.
Yeah.
And he was thrown off the tram and fell down some stairs, and some people came and helped him.
Yeah. Because he was so overcome by this.
He was so overcome, and for example, he couldn't watch movies if there were any killing or tough things going on in this movie. It had too strong. He actually at some point I remember him telling that he would at some point when he started seeing movies he would just have to say to himself all the time, "This is just a movie. This is just a movie. This is just a movie."
Yeah.
So he kind of built up his resilience, his resistance towards these very strong impressions from the surroundings.
Yeah, and he also mentioned it took him 3 years to get a proper overview of the entire cosmos.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't, it is a very important point to stress, I think. Like, it's not instantaneous.
No, he had to explore it.
He had to explore it. So he got the ability, and then through a lot of question and answers, a lot of self-inquiry, a lot of looking around, so on, he after 3 years or so, he got, now he said, like, now I have a proper overview of how the cosmos actually works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's, in particular, there's one symbol.
Yeah.
He made symbol number 11.
Yeah.
Which is sometimes it's called his main symbol.
Yeah.
And this is where he kind of compromised all the basic factors in his worldview.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we can get to that later on.
And that's, so it's just to say that in 1921 he had this experience, and it wasn't after that. After having conversations with Lars Nibelwang for about 3 years, he started writing a book. And one of the funny things he tells is that the sentences was much too long.
Yeah,
I mean he felt that it would be easier for people to read if he didn't interrupt them all the time with punctures.
Yeah.
But of course it's the other way around. So he had to learn how to express himself in writing in a way. So he's actually started writing one book that never came out, and then after 7 years he started writing Livsbog. Livsbog, meaning the book of life. And one special thing here is that Martinus actually wanted the Danish expression to be used in all languages. Yeah. So he didn't want it translated. It's like we say the Bhagavad Gita, but we don't think of it as the Song of Lords, which I think it means in
the proper translation.
Yeah. And so it's the same with Livsbog. It means the book of life if you translate it directly, but Martinus wanted to be called Livsbog, so I think we should do that from now on.
Yeah, we call it Livsbog for sure. And also I think, I mean, there must be a lot of critics later on who said, like, well, Martinus, he must have this particular knowledge he got. He must have, like, read a lot. He must have read a lot of philosophy, and literature, and science, and so on. But he didn't. He hardly read anything in his life apart from a few. That's true. Yeah, a few fairy tales when he was a boy and so on.
Yeah, and sometimes he would read in say things like dictionaries and so on. Yeah, because one thing he shared is that he had this immense desire to attract concepts that he could use to explain his views, and of course his dialogue with Lars Nibelwang would play a huge role here. But later on, he also had kind of followers or co-workers who were well-versed in science or in other things. So through these dialogues, he would sometimes acquire some concepts that he could use. But he felt that it was part of his mission to demonstrate, and he actually felt there was a deeper meaning behind it being impossible for him to read anything in the beginning, just after he had his initiation. Exactly. That he had this mission to demonstrate that it's possible for a living being, for a human being, to acquire all knowledge from within.
From within. Yeah. And he also, as you mentioned, a dictionary and so on, he also had to invent a lot of terms.
Also
that can be a bit difficult to digest for new readers.
Sure, yeah.
Like concepts like world redeemers and cosmic consciousness and spiral cycles and all sorts of stuff we'll get into in these later episodes and so on. Just to say that he had to, in order to explain a whole worldview of the cosmos that nobody had before, he had to like invent terms and use terms in a different way from how they had been used in language.
Yeah, because some terms like cosmic consciousness is also used by other writers, but he had to give it its own meaning. Yeah. So sometimes he would acquire terms, so to speak, that, I mean, he would also talk about, say, spiritual science, which in Danish is åndsvidenskab, which is a translation of the German Geisteswissenschaft.
Exactly.
And these terms were around. So, for example, Rudolf Steiner would also use the term Geisteswissenschaft about his work. Yeah. And so some of these terms Martinus simply adapted but put into his own use and gave his own meaning to.
Exactly. And I think we just briefly touch on what do we call like the philosophy of science around this. And I know this is one of your favorite topics, and we can make a whole episode just on this. But in terms of one of the main objections I usually hear about Martinus is people say, well, is it scientific?
Yeah.
And then is it and usually what they mean, is it replicable? Is it are you able to reproduce his thought experiments and so on? And is it accessible for other people to do and see the same things? And it's not like not in a classic scientific technical sense, because you need this faculty of intuition to see it. And what he had this faculty, and then through logic of language and so on, he wanted to explain it to people who didn't have cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, and you could also say that one of the preconditions for becoming intuitive in Martinus' use of the term is that you've acquired a balance between what he calls intelligence and feeling.
Yeah.
So it's not enough to have intelligence.
Yeah.
You also need to have your value system in place, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah.
And this is the role of feeling, that it's the feeling, according to Martinus, is the basis for our humane values.
Yeah.
And you need these, according to Martinus, that you could say that's kind of his epistemology.
Yeah.
That is that how we acquire knowledge. It's not enough to have intelligence.
Sure.
You need feeling. You need to have your heart in the right place.
Yeah.
And have the right kind of sense of values to understand these things.
Exactly. Exactly. That's one of the things that appealed to me a lot about Martinus cosmology. It's both very moral and it's also very logical, because I see like around. If you look around the spiritual landscape, so to speak, you can see a lot of religions or cults or sects or whatever. You either they're too materialistic or scientific, or they're too feeling based and not very logical. But I think, like in Martinus' respect, he got to explain things that are kind and in a very logical way.
Yes, there's a good balance there between. Yeah. I mean, it's all about love. What is, and he once said that. His sole desire was to make people love one another. Yeah. So that's the kind of value that is at the basis of his system of ideas, you could say. Yeah. But also, of course, in his view, this is also the basis for the universe, for the existence of the universe. Yeah. It's this, I mean, universal love is the basis, in his view, for everything. And he wanted to I mean, one way to explain what he did is that you can ask the question, in what kind of universe does the behavior of the Christ make sense? Sure. Be logical. Yeah. And this is what he tried to describe, how the universe, the kind of universe in which the behavior of the Christ makes sense and is logical. And of course, you could so argue that, but this is just wishful thinking. And in a way it is, but that's actually because one of the, you could say, basic things in Martinus's worldview is that the universe is how it is because it's desirable that the universe is in this way. It's a living being.
Yeah.
So it's the universe in itself is a living being with with value, with a sense of value.
Yeah, sure.
And so we live in a universe in which everything is as it is because it's desirable.
Yeah.
And of course, this also brings us into the fact that he wanted to explain the darker sides of life.
Yeah, which we'll get into in later.
Yeah, so we shouldn't go too much into that, of course, now. But
yeah, but it's interesting because one little detail to mention is that he got this cosmic consciousness, his X-ray vision. He could see everything, both in the physical world, but also in the spiritual world. But what I find surprising about Martinus after I read everything he wrote is that he writes surprisingly little about the spiritual dimensions compared to how much he writes about the day-to-day life of
for sure
of normal people.
Yeah.
But he said that actually that he only wanted to write about what people could see and what you could extrapolate logically from people's day-to-day experiences. So he could have written like 10 volumes purely about how the spiritual world works, but it would be too far-fetched for most people with normal lives to understand it if it wasn't connected to.
He wanted to write about things we could validate for ourselves in our everyday life.
Yeah.
And also perhaps we should, so he started writing his capital work.
Yeah.
It's called Livets Bog, and it's in 7 volumes. And he started writing in 1928, I think, and he finished sometime in the early 1960s.
Yeah, around 1960 he finished the Livets Bog.
Yeah. And then he also created Martinus Institute, which is where we are located now, and this educational center, Martinus Center, and Cosmos, which is the magazine that is published.
Sure.
I'm one of the editors.
Yeah.
But apart from that, Martinus didn't want any kind of organization or formal movement to be constructed around his work.
Exactly, and he's very clear about that. It's not a cult, it's not a sect. You can't have any memberships, stuff like that.
It's not a society.
It's not a society.
It's not an association you can become a member of, no.
Exactly, and I think that's what appeals to a lot of people who are kind of post what he calls the old world impulse. Well, the old world impulse is like organized religion. And I think a lot of people nowadays, they're very fed up with this membership idea. You have to be a member of a certain thing.
Yeah.
And then he was like, it's none of that. We just have the books, and then people, they can come and go as they want. And there's no inclusion, exclusion criteria and so on.
Oh, no. So you cannot become a member, but you cannot lose your membership. So also, it's, maybe you should say that we sit in this Martinus Institute. It's a rather fancy building in a wealthy part of Copenhagen.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So there are money here, and also this educational center. It's quite large as well.
Yeah.
But it's all based on voluntary donations and people freely working for the not to create an association or a movement, but simply to make sure that the books are published.
Sure.
That this Cosmos magazine that writes about Martinus and things happening in the world right now in light of Martinus's worldview.
Yeah.
And then this educational center, so that it will be at least one place in the world where you have the possibility of studying these analyses if you're interested.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the thing. And also there's nobody at top skimming all the money and so on. Like it's very transparent, and there's nobody getting rich of it and so on. Like and I think that particular, I could feel like when I first visited here 15 years ago, I could feel this energy instantly that is very free, it's very non-dogmatic, and people seem to be extremely relaxed about it. It's very non-preachy. And that's also what my girlfriend tells me, like what she ever appreciated about this, like whole.
And one thing we would say is that Martinus' own expression he used about his work is that it should be free like the sun. Yeah. So it's like the sun. You can stand in the sun if you want to, but you can also go into the shadow.
Yeah.
And so very often when he gave lectures, he would say to people, take what you need and leave the rest.
Exactly. Okay, so I think if you just get back to the chronology for a second.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So
you have your checklist.
Exactly. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we get everything right. Yeah. So he had this couple of years where he got the overview of the cosmic, of the cosmos, and he started to write a little bit, and then he started to give lectures in private homes.
Yeah. So the first lecture he gave was there was an associate of Rudolf Steiner. He was actually a friend of Rudolf Steiner. And do you have his name?
No.
Okay, but I've forgotten it too. But so there was a factory owner, I think he was Bernard Lauge.
Sure, perfect.
That was his name. Yeah. And he knew Rudolf Steiner, and Rudolf Steiner actually stayed with him on a few occasions when he went to Scandinavia, and also Bernard Lauge lived with Steiner in Switzerland, in the place he had the Goetheanum for a couple of years. And actually Steiner said something to him that made him expect that there would come some kind of teacher in Denmark. Yeah. So when he learned about Martinus, he felt this is actually what I've been waiting for. Yeah. And so he organized that Martinus could give his first lectures for a group of anthroposophers and also some other specially invited people. Yeah. But that was only the beginning. Very early on, Martinus. So this is where he could kind of practice his first
communication skills.
Communication skills, yeah. And then after that, he went on to start giving lectures more publicly.
So yeah, he gave his first public lecture when he was 40 years old in 1930.
Okay, yeah.
And then he started his main work, the Livets Bog, as we mentioned, and he was done with that when he was 70 years old. And he wrote his whole life, both the Book of Life and also a lot of other books, around 10,000 pages in total, and also 100 symbols.
Yeah, which are collected in the 6 volumes called The Eternal World Picture.
Yeah, exactly. And for people interested, they can go to martinus.dk and see all the symbols for themselves, also with explanations in English.
Yeah. That's kind of the pixie version. Yeah, you could say, just reading the symbols and some rather brief explanations.
Yeah. Yeah, and then in 1935...
If I could just say one thing more. Yeah, sure. On the webpage, you can also read Martinus' book and or his books. Some of them are translated into English. Exactly. A large part of the Capital work, Livets Bog, is translated, and a lot of articles are translated to English. But also in other languages, you can also find a few translations that are actually accessible on the webpage.
Exactly. So the thing is, it's interesting that he's been translated into multiple languages like Japanese and Serbian,
Chinese
and Esperanto and Portuguese and lots of stuff. So, yeah, but I think also as the time of this recording, his entire work has not been translated into English yet. Nope. It's still in the process. I think English is the main priority in terms of translation.
I think there are 5 volumes of Livets Bog translated into English that you can read on the webpage.
Yeah, exactly. And I think then you can, hopefully through these podcasts and so on, you can get a bit of a taste about what Martinus is all about. But if you really want to get out into the weeds of it, you have to read it yourself, because there's endless details and explanations and so on in his writings.
Yeah.
Because he said like his lectures and so on, they were just like little displays about the ideas that he had. But if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, I think it's a great place to go and read it. But then back to the chronology. In 1935, he bought this summer vacation area in Klint in northern Sjælland initially for followers to come and meet and have a summer holiday. And and this has developed. It's soon to be 100 years old, and it's an amazing place. I spent many summers there.
It's 90 years this year.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's mostly. I mean, there's activity there all year round.
Yeah.
And Martinus was quite sure that eventually it would become a proper school where you could study any time of the year. Yeah. So right now it's in the summer holiday season. Mm-hmm. It's 6 weeks where you can study very intensely. 2 of those are international
weeks. Yeah. So if you don't speak any Scandinavian languages, you can come there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And there will be interpretation. So you're one of the interpreters of lectures there.
Yeah. Yeah, and then in 1943, during the Second World War, this institute where we're sitting right now was acquired and has been like the main hub of the administrative work since then.
Yeah.
And then he spent the rest of his life, like after he got cosmic consciousness and the overview of the cosmos and so on, he spent the rest of his life writing and giving lectures, organizing the institute as well, and also meeting people in private. He was a very social person, and the circle of friends and acquaintances grew and grew and grew over the years. And he would sometimes in the afternoons when he was done with the writing for the day, he would meet people
who would counsel people.
He would counsel people who came with
people
who come with all sorts of different problems, and he had a great sense of social skills and some ability to tune into exactly where people were and how to help them properly.
Yeah, and he also every time people came to him, asked him for help with their personal problems. Very often he would start asking a question: "Do you pray?" And if people didn't pray, he would suggest that they started praying. And he said, it doesn't matter if you believe it. You don't have to believe it. There's a kind of magic in prayer, and actually it has to do with this fact that Martinus experienced in this golden baptism of fire, that in the very core of our being there's this divine essence, so to speak, and prayer is it's a way to contact that part of yourself, which is ultimately us, also a part of everyone else. So it's this kind of divine field, and very powerful field that we can. And also he said about prayer, it's not like this magic lamp from Aladdin or anything like that. It's not because it changes your circumstances dramatically. I mean, it probably could do that sometimes, but something has to change in you for things to change around you.
Again, we'll have a whole separate episode on prayer itself.
So just to wrap up, he would suggest that people used prayer even if they didn't believe it, because it would strengthen their inner resilience towards the kind of problems they were actually facing.
Exactly. And I also think, just to talk about him as a person also, because he was very keen on the idea that he should not be the center of attention. He should not be anything resembling a cult leader, or people shouldn't worship him or anything. He's just like, he really tried to maintain this image of being a regular guy, wearing regular suits. He looked extremely normal, and no worship cult or anything. But he was good at showing a personal example, because people say he would never get angry, ever.
No.
Not even under conditions that were extremely stressful. He just stayed completely calm all the time. Not in a naive kind of way, but he had this, as I said, this overview that he could see situations in a much bigger light than not normal people would. And I think that's one of the things that I find very credible with this whole thing, because if he was an extremely angry man, or if he had like all sorts of weird sexual exploits or so on, it would be a lot less credible. but he was very like calm and down to earth, and
And maybe you should say here that his life is actually documented in a remarkable, great detail. I mean, even from childhood, like statements from school or statements from employers and so on.
Yeah.
And also, he had people all around him from 1920 on, 21 and onward. All the time there were people around him. So he was practically never alone. So we have a lot of testimony and evidence about his character.
Exactly.
And also this thing about, I mean, he said, this time it's not about the person.
Yeah.
So he talked about the mission of the Christ was to demonstrate by personal example what it means to be a perfected human being created in the image of God.
Yeah.
And this was not Martinus's mission, because this example has already been given.
Exactly.
So Martinus's mission, he relates it to this idea of the Paraclete, the Holy Ghost that would take from Jesus or the Christ what was his and present it to man so we can understand it.
Okay.
And Martinus said that he as a person was not this Holy Ghost, the Paraclete, the Holy Ghost. It's a symbol, it's a metaphor for a science. And so his mission was to lay the foundation for this science that would actually explain the Christ mentality and make it accessible to everyone who's interested and who want to move in this direction.
Actually, as I said, we will have a separate episode on Martinus and Christianity, but just a brief anecdote is that actually Christ also had, in his view, cosmic consciousness, but he told the cosmic truth in a very, like, almost like a kid's story kind of way, using these parables that were understandable for people at the time, very uneducated people back 2,000 years ago, who had, like, if you presented Martinus's worldview to people in Galilee 2,000 years ago, they wouldn't understand anything of what you were saying. So it takes a certain maturation of the planet and of the population of the planet to be able to understand in a logical and scientific and humane way what he was actually saying.
Yeah. So he said that the Christ, it wouldn't make sense that the Christ would write because people couldn't read at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Just a note here about what I call the old world impulse.
So Martinus, I mean, he has this rather, it can look like a fanciful explanation somehow, but he sees the whole universe as living and in communication. Yeah. And so the planet we're living on is actually communicating with other planets.
Yeah, that's where it gets really trippy.
That's where it gets trippy. Yeah. And so we are receiving on this planet some kind of impulses from another planet near the center of the galaxy.
Sure.
And these impulses, they come rhythmically in certain intervals. So for a couple of thousand of years ago, there was a very strong impulse that gave rise to Christianity and Buddhism, and eventually also Islam, and also perhaps things like Taoism and so on, and for that matter, even Greek philosophy. And this impulse changed society. And you can actually, if you're into the study of the scientific study of culture, there's actually something called the axial age, which is a term that is used about these changes that happened at that time. Yeah. And so Martinus believed that in this time we live in right now, a new impulse is coming, and it's what came through very dramatically in 1921. Yeah. And Martinus was actually in a way a receiver. Yeah. He could receive this impulse and he could transform it into these word forms and symbols that are understandable for us.
And actually, for this to make sense, you have to understand that in his worldview, like you see the the universe is a living being, the galaxy is a living being, the solar system is a living being, and the Earth is a living being. And then for most people, when they hear that for the first time, that sounds a bit strange. But you have to expand your notion about what a living being actually is. And then, and then like if you say like the planet is a living being itself that goes through the same kind of development in some sense as a human being does. And and then because most people who are interested in spirituality, they might have heard, other masters or spiritually inclined people talk about how consciousness is coming into the world, and like the planet is going through development and so on. But I think what Martinus he could speak about was that this idea of development is something that is going on forever.
Evolution.
Evolution. It's been going on forever, and it will continue forever. And planets and people, all beings, people and planets and animals and whatever it is, they all go through this cycle of evolution and involution, into the darkness, into the light, into the darkness, into the light. And we'll get into detail later on. But just to put it in context here, said like, there's a reason why Martinus he arrived at this particular point as he did, because the Earth as itself, he explained that it had a very dim aura around the time of Christ, and it has been growing lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter. And then people are becoming more moral and more intelligent. And then it's going through various phases, and then it corresponded to this new phase where we put the old dogmatic religions, like the old world impulse, behind us, and now people have to think for themselves.
For sure, yeah. So that's a very important part, this fact that Martinus didn't want believers. Yeah. He wanted to attract explorers, people who want to find out for themselves.
Exactly.
And he wanted to present his ideas as inspiration to that process. Yeah. And also, I want just to add briefly, this idea that the universe is living is not a new idea. Yeah. So if we go back in time, traditional, there's been two kind of metaphors for understanding the universe. Yeah. Either as a living being, that's called organism, or as a machine, that's called mechanism. Yeah. And the latter is quite new in the larger perspective. It's only in the 17th century people started thinking about the universe as a machine. Yeah. And so you have you have tendencies, you have things like deep ecology, for example, in the time we live in right now, where people are coming back to this idea about at least the planet being a living being. But also there are other thinkers who think about the whole universe as living. So that's not where Martinus is original. The originality comes in how he's detailed out the all these different, say, dimensions of life, you could call it. Sure. Yeah. And nobody, to my knowledge, has done that before him. Yeah. To that level of detail and.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, different religions and different gurus and different spiritual masters through the ages, they have some aspects of it, some corners of it. They have seen it, but I think Martinus, what he does is like he's the first one who like lays out the entire rule book of the cosmic mechanism, so to speak.
That's how he presented himself.
Yeah, yeah.
And we can only find out by exploring his worldview.
Exactly. And then he says, like, if he tried to condense his mission down to one thing, he says, like, also sort of jokingly, he said, like, my mission is to prove that it pays off to be nice.
Yeah.
Because now we get into that in a later episode, but we're getting away from the animal kingdom towards the real human kingdom, and which is more in line, more in tune with how the universe actually works because of the law of karma and so on. So what goes around comes around. And actually the basic structure of the universe is that everything goes in circles, right? And so if you want to have a great life, be nice to other people because it will come back to you in some sense. Yeah. And that's what he said, like, my mission is to show that it pays off to be nice. And as I mentioned, people come from all sorts of backgrounds. When they're interested in Martinus, it can be atheists, it can be people who've been in very dogmatic backgrounds, or it could, all sorts of walks of life. And then they find out, oh, this Martinus guy, he actually finally he gives explanations about all the stuff that I've been wondering about.
Talking about, I mean, we're human beings, but we're not, in Martinus's view, perfected human beings.
Exactly.
We're in a process of evolution.
Yeah.
And it is this, and also we should say, a part of this evolution happens automatically. But once we reach a certain point, we have to take matters into our own hands.
Yeah.
Evolution is something we have to consciously participate in.
Yeah.
And it's this process that Martinus wants to inspire.
Yeah.
He wants us to inspire us to participate in our own process of evolution towards that state that he calls the perfected human being, created in the image of God.
Yeah. Exactly, because it says we and the planet and the universe and so on, it has a direction, and we're kind of waking up to that because we've been in the dark for so long, and now we're waking up to there's actually a pattern to all this, and maybe I should play along with the pattern instead of just walking around in the dark as we've been doing for many incarnations.
Yeah, we've been confused.
Exactly, been very confused, and it's very very typical. People that go through, we'll get back to that in a later episode and so on, but we've been through some periods about extreme separation, and very a mechanistic worldview, an atheist worldview, and so on. But that's all part of the plan, because you have to be separate from God and then come back to a position where you are close to God again. And that's because we've been so saturated by this darkness and separation, which is part of the plan again. And now through these new impulses that are coming over the earth, we are moving into another sphere, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is, Martinus, he's almost like a secret. Very few people know about him. He's very few people outside of Scandinavia, for sure.
Yeah. I guess in Scandinavia, you could say there's a few thousand who are explicitly interested in his work, and it doesn't go quiet about it. And of course, we don't know how many people. We can say that his books they're not bestsellers yet.
No, but he was also open about that. It says my work will most likely be known in 300 to 500 years from now, on a global scale. Yeah,
I think he said different things at different times, so I'm a little confused about that. But for sure, this is not it's not a quick fix.
No,
it's not something that would change our lives from today till tomorrow.
Yeah.
So he had a longer perspective, and we'll just have to see how it goes.
Sure thing. All right, I think that's the end of my notes for this round.
Yes.
Do you have anything else?
No, I think it's a good place to stop.
Okay, well then let's wrap it up.